a dozen times, but it's been a great pleasure to have RUSI as really the co-founder of the Veterans Oral History course and program. It was a veteran who was active in RUSI over, well, I think 25 years ago, John Eggenberger, who and myself took the initiative to start matching students up with veterans and basing their research essays on the interviews they did with veterans. And we've been doing this ever since. Alas, I think this course I've taught this term may be the last time. I'm retiring officially July 1st, 2026. The university literally made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and it didn't involve any horses' heads in the bed. I was actually quite pleased with the offer they gave me, and I'll be leaving. But the unfortunate thing is the reality, both financial and political, is that I won't be replaced. And there's been a military historian at UVic since before there was a university. As my predecessor, Reg Roy, actually started at Victoria College and then moved over to the university. Reg, of course, himself, a highly decorated infantry soldier of the Second World War. He was always proud of the fact that he joined in 1939 as a boy soldier to escape starvation in Cape Breton at the age of 16, and went on to be one of the few frontline infantry officers to survive serving all the way from Sicily right through until when the D-Day Dodgers were transferred to Northwest Europe at the end of the war. I can remember Reg having lunch at the faculty club. I think he did it once a week. And he was there as the lieutenant, but historian, and there was a corps commander and 3 division commanders always at the table. Quite distinguished bunch. So let me begin my talk by saying that this is really a talk about technology, and it's not a talk about condemning the Royal Air Force. It's about, in fact, the world of technology as it existed in the decade or so leading up to the Second World War. And it was a period of very, very rapid technological transformation. That's true in all arms, but no more so than in the Air Force, where there was literally a technological revolution going on in aviation technology, which would bear fruit really in the mid-1930s. And something that I don't think other people have mentioned, but I find this an extraordinary thing, and I may correct me if anyone can think of an exception. There was no airplane in an Air Force in frontline service in 1935 that wasn't totally obsolete in 1939. Think about it. How long have we been flying F-18s? Right? Yes, they're at the end of their life. But the notion that planes were obsolete before they actually entered squadron service. And the transformations, from the Hawker Hind here, which has some modern characteristics, but it's still a biplane. Mainly cloth covered, but it has metal, it has streamlining, it has a fixed landing gear. And aircraft that would replace it in part, the Vickers Wellington, a modern monoplane, retractable landing gear, capable of flying much higher, much further, much heavier bomb load, much faster. So technology was in a state of rapid evolution. And it would be unfair to condemn the Air Force officers of the period for not knowing what the future held. And there were many bad decisions made. There were many good decisions made in this period leading up to the war. Now, I apologize for this. This was something that happened during the switching over to the computer, but it's not important. But revolutionary change was going on not just in air forces. This ship here, cutting edge, battleship, 1930, say, I deliberately picked this ship because it's the USS Arizona. And you all know what happened to the USS Arizona on December 7th, 1941. Of course, then there's these ships, aircraft carriers. What role would they play? Mostly, everybody got it wrong. Even with aircraft carriers, they may have invested in aircraft carriers, but they didn't really know how they were going to be used. Even the Japanese, who had such success at Pearl Harbor, didn't fully appreciate how they should be used. Certainly not until after Midway, until it was too late. But then you get this guy here, a U-boat. That's its entire crew. This ship, this U-boat, ship, sorry, submariners, boat, it's arriving back from having sunk the battleship Royal Oak at Scapa Flow at the beginning of the war. Okay? And what role would these submarines play? Almost all navies, except for the German Navy, anticipated they would be used primarily for scouting for the fleet. And in fact, the Royal Navy was convinced this device here, what they called ASDEC, what we would call active sonar, would make sure that submarines wouldn't be a major threat as they had been in the First World War. So technology was really in a state of uncertainty in this period. And of course then, for the armies, who knows where mechanization would go? I could have a whole talk about that, where I tell you, in fact, the Germans got almost everything wrong, and they, in fact, were lucky at the beginning of the war. So this actually talk has some contemporary relevance, and this is actually something I've added to the talk just for today. Because if you think about it, when the Russians attacked Ukraine, they thought this would be the decisive weapon on the ground. And they thought the other decisive weapon would be this, right? They were, of course, completely correct. And by the way, everyone thought Ukraine didn't have a chance of surviving more than a few weeks because, after all, the Russians had so many more of those tanks and so many of those, more of those jet aircraft. But instead, to some surprise, although to be fair, there were people talking about this, the significance of drones in all different aspects as being one of the key weapons of this conflict, of small guided missiles, both for anti-tank and anti-aircraft, which really reduce the importance of the main battle tank, as well as fighter aircraft and helicopters as well. And then, of course, the queen of the battlefield reestablishes itself, artillery. Who would ever thought you'd see another war where towed artillery would be a crucial weapon? And in fact, of course, this is what happens to a Russian tank column advancing after being ambushed by the Ukrainians. And the war continues. So we're in this state right now of total flux of technology. It's hard to know exactly where we're going with it. And it was just as difficult for the officers in the 1930s. And part of the reason why it was so complicated was the very understanding of the way the universe worked was being reassessed in this period. The Newtonian worldview of the orderly universe was shattered by 1920. Einstein had his great year in 1905. He then had his general theory of relativity. He published in 1915. And the British astronomer Eddington and Dyson proved Einstein's hypothesis that gravity would bend light in 1919. And still, it continued forward. In 1927, Heisenberg's quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle befuddled almost everyone else in the world. In fact, so much so, as my former cat Midnight here will testify, and he didn't die in the box, don't worry. Schrodinger's cat is a ridiculous case to demonstrate the uncertainty of the uncertainty principle. He meant it as a joke. Everyone always quotes him as seeing some great insight into uncertainty, but it was actually a joke. So a cat and a tiny bit of radioactive material, a Geiger counter and a hammer, and a glass vial of poison were all inside a box. And the question is, when you open the box, would the cat be alive or dead, or could you determine without opening the box whether the cat was alive or dead? right? You could do one or the other. And one of the things was that something called death rays was actually theoretically possible. The basic theory of some sort of energy beam able to destroy things at a long distance existed when Einstein himself published one of his more obscure papers called The Quantum Theory of Radiation in 1917. This is the title page of his obscure article. So, scientific world was in a state of flux, but so was the world of technology. One of the extraordinary things that happened, radio had played an important role in the First World War, but radio that was used in the First World War was all based on actually an incorrect interpretation of the realities of radio. They were all long-wave radio sets because the basis was they didn't believe shortwave could travel more than about 10 or 12 miles. Right? And after the war, they determined that nobody who wasn't government could have access to the long-wave wave bands. So they gave to the amateur radio enthusiasts short waves because they wouldn't be of any risk to anyone, spreading knowledge. And then ham radio operators began to bounce, they didn't know what they were doing really, bounce shortwave radio signals off the ionosphere right around the globe and talking to each other with little tiny sets with hardly any power. And there was Technology is Magic. This book calls radio, 1928, a textbook, Wireless, the Modern Magic Carpet, from 1928, standard textbook. And shortwave radio transformed everything. This is why radio is so much different in the Second World War than it is in the First. Well, how does this get us to death rays and really to its relationship to the story of radar? Because this is what I want to talk about. Now, the traditional story of death rays and the discovery of British radar is well known, and it's contained in the memoirs of two of the most important British scientists. One, Robert Watson Watt, who really invented British radar in 1935, and the other, the man whose book is on the right, A.P. Rowe, Archibald Percival Rowe, the man with the pipe in the picture on his memoirs, One Story of Radar, recounted the tale of the discovery of radar. Now, 25 years ago, I published a book called Britain Shield. And this book was the first scholarly study of the development of the radar air defense system that won the Battle of Britain. And one of the things that I challenged was the memoirs of radar scientists, which everyone had just relied on. Watson Watt, particularly, his accounts were filled with sins of omission, half-truths, and errors. In fact, to be blunt, he was an outright liar on many occasions. But one story I could not challenge because I couldn't find the documents had to do with, go back to death rays. Because death rays played an important role in Watson Watt's story and A.P. Rowe's story of the discovery of radar. Now, why death rays? Well, death rays were a common subject of discussion in the interwar period, even before the end of the First World War. People were talking about death rays all the time. This is a poster issued by an American publishing company. They sold these things on newsstands. And it reads, News Note, U.S., England, and France interested in newly discovered death ray. What is a terrible, mysterious force that can destroy battleships, bring airplanes crashing to the ground, and wipe out whole armies at a distance of 8 miles. And here it is. And everyone's lining up here. These are the different countries. See Uncle Sam and John Bull. And you can see the inventor with his crazy helmet on demonstrating his death ray. And everywhere there were death rays. From 1915, this article talking about a newfangled death ray and, interestingly enough, the use of biological weapons. This also from 1915, which calls exploding by wireless, describing a death ray. This is from the post-war period from 1924. German invention spread death rays on the battlefield. This is from 1925. Death rays stories are so common. This little piece simply says, another death ray. Yet here's another death ray. And this guy from a lecturer in mechanical and electrical research at Sheffield University who claims to have invented a death ray. And this is my favorite. And by the way, I've found hundreds of these stories. I've only given you a very small sample. Death ray inventor is sent to hospital to test his sanity. And this is the only sane headline of the bunch, right? They sent him away to examine. Now, of all of the death ray hoaxsters, because that's what they really all were, the most infamous or almost successful was this man, Henry Grendel Matthews. And Grendel Matthews, some people think he was an inventor genius, the same way they talk of Tesla, but really he was a huckster and a con man. He was a trained electrical engineer. He had done important work before the First World War in radio telephony. In 1915, he claimed to have invented a remote control system for controlling ships using light. And all the writers on him claim that he was awarded £25,000 by Lord Fisher himself, the first Sea Lord, for this invention. I can't find any document evidence that states this. In 1922, he actually invented a sound movie technology, and he demonstrated it by doing an interview just weeks before he died of the great Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer. However, none of these seemed to give him enough money. He was a high life. In 1924, he announced to the British public that he invented a death ray. And here are some of the news stories. Death ray inventor. He went to the British government. He said, buy my death ray. The British government actually sent technical experts. And he demonstrated them. And they noticed strange things like there were funny wires that they couldn't quite figure out where they were going. And they demanded their own independent test. Grendel Matthews says, no, until you give me the check. You're not seeing it. So the British government refused to buy it. When that happened, Grendel Matthews announced to the press, I'm going to France. If the British government is too stupid, the French will take it. And here's the headline. The Daily Mail warning that the super weapon is going to be in the hands of the evil French. And this is the threat. As a result, there were actually questions asked in the House of Commons, demanding to know why the government would not purchase the death ray. And the response from the Undersecretary of Air was, in essence, to say, well, we would if we can demonstrate it to our satisfaction that it actually works. He wouldn't, and so he went to France. Now, by this time, Grendel Matthews is a celebrity. So much so that here's an ad for him. Mr. H. Grendel Matthews, the famous inventor and discoverer, is recommending you use phosphorine tablets, the magical tablets that will cure every disease under the sun. If Matthews says it's true, then everyone should have these pills. Now, Matthews returned from France without a deal. The French were no more convinced than the British were. But every movement of his actions were followed by the British press. He made a movie on death rays to demonstrate the effectiveness of death rays. It didn't persuade the British government. So Matthew got on a boat to go to the United States to sell it to the American government. Fortunately for the American government, on that boat he found a rich American widow. And they got married on board. That was the end of his death ray promotion. Until he fleeced her for all that she had. But more seriously than this is the fact is that there was a real problem in the 1930s. And the real problem for the British government was the famous line from Stanley Baldwin, a speech he gave, the former British Prime Minister at the time, the speech he gave in the House of Commons, where he said these lines, the bomber will always get through. And he was right, that there was no way to stop modern bombing aircraft from reaching British cities and bombing them And the biggest single problem they had was they had no way of either shooting them down at a long distance or detecting them. There was a technology that there had been much investment that went into during the 1920s, based on technology from the First World War, invented by the French. By the way, almost all First World War technologies of importance, and Bill Stewart may jump up and down and shout, I'm wrong, but almost all important technologies of the First World War were invented by the French. Not quite. But they invented these acoustical listening devices. And throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, there was a major British government program run by the Royal Engineers, headed by a guy with a PhD, William Tucker, who designed acoustical mirrors. And these are some of the acoustical mirrors. This device here is this last development of this technology. It was a 200-foot long, from end to end, strip mirror of highly polished concrete. And the sound would bounce off the concrete, and in the forecourt in front of it, there are all these microphones. And Tucker may be known, for those of you who know about the First World War, as he developed some of the tunable microphones that were used for gun sound ranging. So his expertise was in microphone technology. And he could detect an aircraft and give its location, but not elevation, up to 25 miles away with this technology. That's great. However, didn't persuade anyone that it would work. One of the problems is the Royal Air Force knew planes were getting faster and faster, and as they approached the speed of sound, sound is a finite commodity. The quicker you're going, closer you are to the speed of sound, the less actual time you have. And in fact, it was soon realized that planes by the late 1930s would be traveling so fast, the acoustical mirrors would hear them, but in the time it took them to analyze the information and disseminate it, the plane would already flown overhead. And there was this widespread fear in Britain of the bomber, of what it would do at the beginning of a war. This is highlighted by the great British science fiction movie Things to Come from 1936, starring, of course, the great Canadian actor Raymond Massey in multiple roles. And this movie starts with the destruction of London at the opening hours of a war by an enemy, unspecified enemy's bomb attack. And of course, all of civilization is wiped out as a result. So there's real fear. So this gets us to the traditional story of radar. And this traditional story is that A.P. Rowe, who was one of the senior scientists of the Air Ministry, when looking through all the files of the Air Ministry, trying to find some idea to stop the bombers. And the only ideas that came up, and he claimed multiple files about, were death rays. So he called his boss, the man here on this side here, Henry Wimpress, the director of scientific research at the Air Ministry. And Wimpress was famous. It was claimed in the memoirs for offering 1,000 pounds to anyone who could kill a sheep at 100 yards with a death ray. And Rowe said, well, I know, Henry, you don't believe in death rays, but this is the only idea we have. Maybe we should ask someone if a death ray was possible. And Wimpress went to this man, A.V. Hill, Archibald Vivian Hill, a Nobel Prize-winning physiologist, who had also been a pioneering defense scientist in the First World War, who had put anti-aircraft artillery onto a scientific footing. And he asked Hill, A.V., can we build a death ray? Can we melt the brain of a pilot at 50 miles? That's why he asked Hill, because he was a physiologist. He should know. Hill says, I don't have a clue. Why don't you ask Robert Watson Watt, the British government's leading radio scientist? So he did, and he asked Robert Watson Watt, can you build a death ray? Watson Watt went to his research assistant, Arnold Skip Wilkins, and said, what energy was required to boil 5 pints of water at 5 miles? Wilkinson claims that he immediately knew this was the death ray. That's how much water is in the human body, apparently. And he did the calculations, and Watson Watt chuckled, I thought so. And he went back to the Air Minister and he said, hey, we can build a death ray, but it will require enough power going through one single circuit, the entire power we used to power electricity for the city of London. And that circuit would burn out within a millisecond, and the death ray would go about 6 inches, and that would be it. However, at the end of his memorandum, he said this: have you guys thought about the fact that radio signals, shortwave radio signals, are reflected by aircraft? They've been interfering with my experiments on the ionosphere for years. Why don't you use that as an early warning system? The story is that as a result, the British Air Force organized a TISR committee, the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, which it was claimed would oversee the development of what became known as radar. And on the 25th of February 1935, in a farmer's field near Daventry, England, Robert Watson Watt, using very primitive receiver technology, he used the transmitter, was actually the BBC shortwave towers at Daventry, the most powerful shortwave antennas in the world. And with using an old bomber, he was able to show that they could, in fact, deflect radio waves from an aircraft, and that could be used to detect them at long range. Now, the traditional story is that once they had radar, death rays were forgotten about. They were idiotic. That's what I wrote in my book 25 years ago. I was wrong. Because since they've digitalized the finding aids at the British National Archives, I was able to find the true story, which were buried not in military records, but in the morass of the Treasury. And there I found this extraordinary thing. This is Roe to Wimpress, 6 months after the Daventry experiment. Although it is exceeding unlikely that any of these death rays inventors of anything of value, I have been most impressed with Krauss than any others. Krauss has stated definitely that he has detonated screened explosives and it killed animals at a distance of 100 meters. So this is after radar, and they're still talking about death rays. This goes directly against what the memoir writers wanted you to believe. And in fact, they negotiate with this guy, Krauss. He's German, but he lives in Britain. And they actually negotiate from July 1935 to February 1936, and they sign a contract. And here's interesting. You know the story that Wimpress was offering a prize for £1,000? I found no evidence of this. But the contract offered Krauss £1,000 if he could demonstrate independently that his death ray worked. And here is the signed, this is the signed contract. I actually have another copy of the sealed contract. So it was signed, sealed, and delivered contract. The Krauss would get £1,000 once he delivered the death ray. So they continued to think that death rays would be necessary. Radar didn't kill it. And the reason was radar didn't allow you to shoot down aircraft. It allowed you to detect aircraft. Now, this is one of the amazing things about this. It is that in March 1936, I have found this letter, again in this file, Wimpress writing to Sir Hugh Dowding. Now, this is the Dowding of Fighter Command in the Battle of Britain. But in this period, he is the head of research and development for the Royal Air Force. And Wimpress writes to Dowding, when the TISR committee was formed, it was contemplated to use it for the examination of death ray proposals. So the TISR committee, the famous TISR committee, was not founded to investigate radar, but death rays. Indeed, this was one of the reasons for the appointment to it of Professor A.V. Hill, an eminent physiologist. His knowledge was designed to be supplemented by Professor Patrick Blackett, who brings with him the latest knowledge of the work of electric radiation from the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge. So the whole TISR committee was founded to investigate death rays, and everything that's been written about it, either in the case of Robert Watson Watt, he either forgot, and he was mentally ill when he wrote his memoirs, or he lied. I did it because I didn't have anything else to base it. But everything that's been written about this is wrong. The TISR committee, the committee that everyone claims was involved with the development of radar, was actually founded for death rays. It's treated much more seriously than anyone had believed. Now, the contract didn't last. The TISR committee, along with Watson Watt, in March 1936, met with Krauss and two representatives of his company called Metal Extractions. After questioning the three men, the committee did not believe their claims and concluded that the basis of them was fraud, but possibly lunacy. They warned that Krauss might also be an agent, because he was German, who wished to obtain information as to anything we were doing on these or similar lines. So the contract was canceled at that point. But this was over a year after radar had been discovered and when the British are setting up their full-scale radar research program. And of course, radar would be the key. This is a picture that for some reason didn't transfer over to this computer. But as you know, that radar-based system saved Britain in the Battle of Britain. But if you can imagine the effort they spent on death rays. There was one other examination of death rays by the TISR committee. That was the lunatic proposal by Tesla, who in his old age was trying to con people into buying his death ray, which they determined was also fake. So that was one example, that they actually had so little understanding of the possibilities of technology, the practical possibilities of technology, they invested so much time into death rays. Now I want to look at another project, which was in many ways equally ludicrous. And this is the famous Bolton-Paul Defiant, the turreted fighter. 4 guns in the rear turret, 2-man crew, no forward-firing machine gun. Now the Bolton-Paul Defiant is this sort of rock star of popular culture of the Second World War. Perhaps that's a mixed metaphor there. But there's the Airfix model kit. And by the way, 2 different scales. There's metal models, like this is the Corgi 176 scale model of the Defiant. There's dozens of books on the Defiant. One of my favorite is a recent novel, Breaking Point, by a writer by the name of John Rhodes, which, believe it or not, concludes with an Me-110, the German twin-engine fighter, strafing an airbase. And on that airbase is this old World War I fighter ace, who's now the space commander, and he's killed by the Me-110. And his friend is beside him, a battle-weary fighter ace, flew Spitfires. And then there's his girlfriend, the hard-drinking, smoking gal scientist. And after their friend is killed, the only plane on the base is a Defiant. And the pilot jumps into the Defiant front seat, and the girl scientist jumps into the rear turret, and they take off after the Me-110 to bring it down. I won't give away the end of the novel, but that's true. And then, more seriously, there are books like this book here, Robert Verkeck, Defiant, The Forgotten Heroes of the Battle of Britain. He's a journalist who writes popular history and uses connections in the media to get all sorts of free publicity. This book was reviewed in every single major British newspaper. I wish I could get my books reviewed this way. And this is this claim that the Defiant somehow was misunderstood. It was, in fact, a great aircraft, and it was just improperly used. However, there's no question that Defiant was a failure. And in fact, there's also no question that the Air Ministry, after the Defiant was withdrawn from service in 1943, tried to cover up the real reason it was withdrawn from service. And there's an official report, which I found in the archives, which talked about this. And it says, this is the Air Ministry's official statements, its reception and the use by the RAF are not part of the development story, but must be recorded that the Air Council agreed in April 1940 that as an operational type, it had come into service 2 years too late, and thus was verging on obsolescence, said this 1943 report. However, that's a lie. The official explanation that it was 2 years too late for service was a lie, because the Defiant was a fully modern aircraft. There's the Defiant. That's the last of the biplane fighters, the Gloucester Gladiator. That was frontline service 1938. By the way, this is actually more modern than it should be, because this is one of the Gladiators that saw service on Malta during the war, and they actually improved the plane by giving it a variable pitch 3-prop propeller. The original Gladiators only had a two-prop, a fixed propeller. And here's the Spitfire, of course. And which aircraft looks modern? Right? The Defiant looks a lot like the Spitfire, except for that funny turret at the back. In fact, it shared the same engine as the Spitfire and Hurricane. It had all the attributes of modernity. It was streamlined. It was all metal construction. It had retractable landing gear. It had a variable pitch propeller. Everything about it was modern. So this is not true. So how did this plane ever come into being? And by the way, this plane is so unusual. No other Air Force ever considered such a stupid plane. Okay? And it all goes down to thinking about the future of aviation technology around 1930, when the man who was head of the Royal Air Force, Air Marshal Sir Edward Ellington, argued that what we needed with aircraft of much higher speed, he said, with the increasing speed of aircraft, conventional fighter tactics as used in the First World War were now too dangerous for the pilots and the fighters. They would crash into each other. And what he said was in 1931, what I think is wanted is an airplane which can be fought against an attack from both the front and from behind in formation. And for this, a two-pilot aircraft is required so that one pilot can maintain the plane, place the aircraft in formation, while the other fights from the front or rear gun or guns, as the case may be. So Ellington was actually arguing that we needed to have a turreted fighter. He was actually originally arguing for a fighter with two turrets, one in the front, one in the back. Now, the man that opposed this idea here, Hugh Dowding, who was head of research and development for the Air Force, he thought it was the stupidest idea I ever heard. And the reason, he argued, was the most important thing for fighter aircraft was speed, and once you put a heavy turret on, the plane cannot be as fast as a single piloted conventional fighter. And the real problem was that what Ellington didn't want to talk about was why he thought aircraft would crash into each other once they're going over 300 miles an hour. And the reason was that the RAF had adopted what were basically the air equivalent of parade ground tactics. It was as if the Army was still fighting on a drill square. And they were fighting in what they called the VIC-3 formations. So a leader with two wingmen. And the wingmen, here you can see them here, were required to stay as close to the tail of their leader as possible. Now it's true, at 300 miles. In fact, in RAF displays, by the way, they would attach ribbons between the planes to demonstrate they could fly so close. Well, yeah, if you're flying that close together in combat, you're going to run into each other. And the notion that you have only one guy firing, the other two are just, for some reason, hanging on to their leader's tail, was bizarre. So what the British were doing was adopting the technology to fit their stupid tactics, rather than changing their tactics to fit the technology. That's a fatal flaw. And you can see here's a VIC-3. Not quite as close, not yet in combat. I know that because the turrets aren't ready to go. Now, another problem was, by the way, that the RAF High Command decided that the Defiant would not have any other guns other than its turret. They did, by the way, abandon the idea of two turrets. They realized that was stupid. They would have one turret. But one of the things that they were concerned of, there had been a two-seat fighter in 1917-18, the Bristol fighter. And these guys argued that the Bristol fighter, which was one of the best fighters on the Western Front, had been fought incorrectly because they didn't let the rear gunner shoot at the enemy unless the enemy got on your tail. That the pilots had actually attacked with their forward-firing guns. So in order to make sure a Defiant pilot couldn't attack and wouldn't just leave the gunner in the turret doing nothing, they wouldn't give him a forward-firing gun. That was deliberate. Tactic. And in fact, they actually hoped that these planes would intercept bombers, flying in formation, and they actually involved lining up all the Defiants on beam to a bomber formation and training their turrets like it was a broadside in the age of the ships of the line. Now, they could go up a little bit, they could go down a little bit, they couldn't fire forward, they couldn't fire directly back because they blow off their tail. But the whole idea was this concept of accuracy, that they could actually get these planes exactly where they wanted them to. The German bombers would cooperate like they did in the Age of Sail. You know, they all lined up to be gentlemen and blast away at each other. That wasn't going to happen. And this whole idea of, they had inaccurate notions of accuracy. They believed they could accomplish amazing things. Another example of this, there's a lot of research into something called aerial minefields, where they actually would drop parachute mines down in front of a bomber formation. Somehow they would magically be able to do that. Anti-aircraft weapons, incredibly inaccurate, unable to deal with high-flying aircraft. Now, you know, during the Blitz, anti-aircraft guns may have been more dangerous to the people on the ground than they were the Germans in the air. Now, I have recently found a new book. It's written by an amateur historian, but he's done a fantastic job. This book, called Lambs to the Slaughter, and by the way, you can get it as a free Kindle Unlimited if you're interested. And he, in fact, has got into the documents of the squadrons, and he's discovered a whole bunch of evidence to show how ridiculous the Defiant really was, and how the Defiant was pressed into service by the high command of the Royal Air Force. And in fact, he's discovered there was a whole fight in the senior echelons of the RAF over this plane, between particularly Shoto Douglas, the assistant chief of the air staff in 1938-39. You may know him as the guy that advocated for the big wings during the Battle of Britain and would arrange for Dowding to be shuttled away and then would take over fighter command in 1941. And Dowding, who is now Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command. And Dowding wrote about the air staff actually told him, you're going to take 9 squadrons of Defiants. The good chunk of your fighter force are going to be these planes. And Dowding had concluded from day one, even before the first design, this was not going to work. And this is what he said to Douglas. You say that we cannot, well, have less than 9 squadrons of Defiants because you are committed to an order of 450 machines. I am very sorry to hear it, but I most earnestly request that no more be ordered until we have a chance of seeing what they can do. The first essential of a fighter is performance, and the second is hitting power. In both of these respects, the Defiant is inferior to contemporary fighters, and in speed it is estimated to have only a 5 miles per hour advantage over the Dornier 17 with the Benz engine. So he was absolutely clear. This plane wasn't going to work. And he's comparing it to the Hurricane and the Spitfires that were then just about to enter squadron service. And he said, this is not going to function. Well, those who support the idea that the Defiant was actually a war-winning weapon talk about the Defiant's performance over Dunkirk when they claim first went into action on May 29, 1945. And according to the official record, the one Defiant squadron was then in service, shot down more German planes than any other squadron in one 3 or 4 day period. It's actually a 3 or 4 day period during the entire Second World War. Something like 65 aircraft. The problem is that when you go back and look at the records, you can't find any evidence of such large numbers of German aircraft being shot down. And to be fair, like many of the early claims of kills by RAF fighter pilots, they were grossly exaggerated. And so there's no evidence of it. And as well, when you look at the operational records, there were several combats before this success in places like the Netherlands, where the Defiant crew's pilots suddenly realized they had to be escorted by Hurricanes or Spitfires. Not a good thing for a fighter to require an escort, because they were too slow and too unmaneuverable if they happen to encounter an ME-109. So the Defiant in combat had this one great success. But eventually, during the battle, there were 2 Defiant squadrons introduced. That was all. They were lucky. The Defiant's production had production problems, which delayed its introduction to service, or there would have been 9 squadrons. And the squadrons were virtually annihilated in a series of air combats in August 1940 during the Battle of Britain. Countering any sort of fighter opposition, the Defiant was doomed. And the notion that you could guarantee a Hurricane or Spitfire escort for them proved to be simply an illusion. And by the way, particularly the rear gunner, they had to create for them a special sort of combined May-West parachute in order so they could squeeze out the exit door if they were lucky and jump if their plane was shot down. Most of them died, couldn't get out. Now, they did attempt to turn the Defiant into a night fighter. And a great deal of work went on in 1940-41 to fit a radar set, an early airborne interception radar set, into a Defiant. The problem was when they finally got it to work at the end of 1941, the Defiant was slower than the new fighter aircraft that was dominating the skies over Britain, the Beaufighter. In fact, it was about 50 miles an hour slower. And the radar had to be operated by the pilot because there wasn't enough room in the turret to put the radar scope to look at. And it was just useless. How did the pilot tell the gunner where it was going to be? Anyway, so they never went forward with it. And the Defiant was finally withdrawn in service, even though by this point they had about 250 had entered service. Now, almost immediately, there were people that defended the Defiant. And I find this remarkable as happened during the war. In the journal Flight, there actually appears 2 letters to the editor, written one by a Defiant test pilot and one by a Defiant pilot who saw squadron service, demanding the Air Ministry reconsider, that they hadn't allowed the Defiant to be fought properly, that there were correct ways if the Defiant could be used. It could be used to destroy a bomber. The Air Ministry was not to be swayed. And in the end product, the Defiant was withdrawn from service, and they'd be served for the rest of the war, if at all, as target tugs with the turrets removed. Although 4 aircraft were used briefly in 1943 as the first electronic countermeasures aircraft. They actually were flown over towards the coast of France, and they created these radar signals, which the Germans detected. Not radar signals, but reflections. They magnified the German radar signals, and they gave the Germans this false idea of raids approaching. And it worked for about 3 or 4 months before the Germans figured out what was happening. They changed filtering and their wavelength, and that was it. But basically, the Defiant ended up being a complete and total failure as a frontline combat aircraft. So, I've talked about Death Rays and Defiants. They're obviously very different things. But what connects them, I believe, is what it tells us about technology in those years leading up to the 1930s. Because we always focus on the successes, right? This is why we think the German Panzer Division was the greatest invention in the history of Army combat. It wasn't. Dennis Showalter, one of the preeminent historians of the German Army, late great historian of the German Army, once said, the fact of the matter, the French military doctrine in 1940 was closer to what would be used to destroy the panzers in Normandy than what the Germans were using against the French. If the French had just simply held that initial attack, they probably would have won because they had overwhelming advantage in firepower, particularly in artillery. So in this case, we see 2 ridiculous inventions. Now, death rays, because they were in fact impossible. I mean, look, how many of you have been in the service? How many death rays did you use? Right?
Can't tell.
You can't. You have to kill me. You have to kill me. You'd have to kill me with a death ray, no doubt. But the fact of the matter is, there's still reading things about trying to use lasers to knock down drones, and apparently they're having some success. Finally, with some sort of particle energy beam weapon. But this is the 1930s, and so you couldn't build a death ray because it wasn't possible. Now with the Defiant, this unbelievably ill-conceived concept based on the desire to preserve a tactic and adopt a tactic to technology, which is the absolute wrong thing to do, right? And this may be where it has this contemporary relevance, because I think that's a lot of what happened to the Russians at the beginning of the war with Ukraine. They had this technology. They were sure they were gonna just roll over, take Kiev in the first few days, and that would be the end of the war. And we always tend to think that we have it right. And I think it's an important thing for the military to consider the fact that it's just possible you might have it wrong. And you have to be very careful when you're making your technological choices, and right now. And I'll give you one example. And I'm a historian. I'm a coward. I don't predict. Okay, I'm not like political scientists. That means I can't be declared as being wrong. Well, I'm often wrong. But the reality is that, should, for instance, the Navy, and if you're a naval officer, don't throw things at me, should the Navy really be building conventional surface combatants in the era of drones, in the era of long-range hypersonic missiles? I don't know. I don't have that answer. But we better be thinking about these things, and the assumption should not be that the technologies that will develop the way we think they are, nor that they will actually work the way we think they're going to work. And this is perhaps the most important thing, and why we have to be critical of looking at these stories and also talk about the failures as well as the successes. I could have talked to you all about the Spitfire and the Hurricane, right? The Royal Air Force got a lot of things right. I wrote a whole book on radar and the air defense system. We got a lot of things right. But really, the true knowledge comes from looking at the things they really got wrong. Thank you very much.